Hello. Thank you for watching today. So this will be my next one in my oldest city videos. And this is actually one of my favorite topics. When it comes to the oldest city of St. Augustine, you have a 460-year range of history to go through. But I really enjoy talking about this part of it in particular. So today's episode in the oldest city is going to be all about Drake's Raid. Let's recap about St. Augustine itself. St. Augustine would be founded on September 8th, 1565, by Pedro Menendez de Aviles, Captain General of the Indies Fleet for Spain. He is under orders from King Philip II to come to La Florida, aka the continent of North America, and remove the French Protestant threat, which is a French Protestant settlement known as Fort Caroline. He is to remove this threat and then set up Spanish permanent settlements and then begin converting natives to Catholicism. He would establish St. Augustine at the expense of many French Protestant lives. However, St. Augustine would, in fact, continue on. They would have their mission grounds set up in the native Timucuan village of Saloy. And I guess this was a good way to do this, being you'd already be right there with the natives trying to convert them. The other picture is actually an example of a 16th century house. And really, I mean, you get over here, you have no idea what to expect, right? The the shape and the house itself just kind of give you an idea of what they're dealing with. I mean, you have a dirt floor and your house is made of sticks and hay, and that's kind of where we get the saying it's raining cats and dogs, because the hay roofs, when it would rain, the cats and dogs would fall through. But either way, St. Augustine seems to be doing fairly well. The relations with the natives are okay. There are some issues with disease, and the natives are, of course, angry because they don't understand any of these European diseases. But for the most part, things are okay. At one point, the Spanish would have to move a little further away from the natives because of those tensions, but eventually everything's worked out. And the city itself is continuing on. They don't have anything from outside affecting them. They, of course, have their issues with the weather. You have the hurricanes, the rain, the extreme heat, the wildlife, of course. You have your diseases, but they don't have any person or any outside issues except for those of everyday life. So this map is really cool. And even though it's labeled Drake's Raid, here's the thing about this map. It is the first known map of a settlement within the United States. It was drawn in 1586 and it was printed by a man named Battista Boazio. I hope I said that right. He was an Italian that worked in London, and he did a lot of maps regarding different travels, especially when it came to Drake and his West Indies sailing, I should say. But the settlement itself, this is St. Augustine. This is how this was laid out. And if you notice, you'll see where you have your inlet and then you have your river, and your fort is a short ways away from the town, which is in the upper left corner. But I want to pay particular attention to the town itself. So, okay, the layout of a settlement, right? And this is essentially the layout of the town of St. Augustine, where the people lived. And you, of course, had this basic layout throughout most of the Spanish settlements. You had, of course, your yellow star is the townhouse. You would have your watchtower for the soldiers to keep watch for, any sort of ships that might attack. And of course, you had your church. But then you would have your streets and you would have your houses and businesses, but you would have a centralized plaza Today they call it Constitution Plaza, and your governor's house would be right near that plaza, and it was the meeting place for the entire town, and this is where you got all of your information that came from your king. But what I love about this is that to this day, the historic district of St. Augustine has tried very hard to keep to this original layout of the town. In the 1590s, King Philip of Spain would send letters to his settlements and say, this is how I want you to have this town laid out. And St. Augustine was already laid out basically the same way before he even decreed that this is how you have to do it. If you visit the town today, you will find a street called Aveley Street. And it's gone by many names throughout its history, but today it can actually lay claim and say it is the oldest street in the United States, because essentially it is the oldest street ever in the United States. So, who was Francis Drake? Well, I say Francis Drake because he was not born with the Sir title. He did not have noble blood. His father was a tenant farmer in Devon, England. He was born a commoner. And so he would go on to work for the Hawkins family, who had a small fleet of ships. They were sailors and traders, and he would get into their employ. It was said that they were distant relatives of his. He is the oldest of 12 sons, and he has essentially mastered the skills of ships. And so he would go on to sail with John Hawkins, especially. He would be in his employ in the year that St. Augustine is founded, the same year of the French Fort Caroline massacre. And whether he is actually with John Hawkins when he visits Fort Caroline, I'm still not positive of, but he was definitely within John Hawkins' employ. His year of birth varies because there are different accounts that suggest it's anywhere between 1540 and 1544. It was not recorded because at the time of his birth, there was this big religious shift within England. And so a lot of the common children's births were not recorded. Eventually, he would gain a huge hatred for the Spanish. And so he would make it his mission to essentially make Spanish life a living hell. Because of his hatred for the Spanish, when Drake finally gets his own ship, he has decided he is going to cause as many issues for the Spanish as he possibly can. And he begins the raiding and plundering. He's raiding settlements, he's plundering ships, and a lot of people don't like to put him in that pirate category. Well, I maintain he is the first famous pirate. Piracy is nothing new. Piracy is being done by the Portuguese and the French and the English. There are many of these sailors that are committing acts of piracy, especially against the Spanish, because they're getting all these treasure ships coming back from Spain, and really, can you blame them? However, Francis Drake would go on to circumnavigate the globe. Of course, he is known for that. He would make a wealth for himself, and he would eventually be brought to the attention of Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth would come on to his ship, the Golden Hind, and knight him right then and there. Well, you had people like Lord Burleigh and Sir Richard Grenville, who had his hand in the Roanoke colony, that they were not fans of Francis Drake because he's a commoner. He was not noble enough, because that really matters, right? And he would prove himself worthy of his title when Elizabeth grants him a fleet of 25 ships in 1585 and says, go do damage. You know what? Spain is mad at us. We're mad at them. go do some preemptive damage. Now, does she officially say this? No. But, you can say something without saying it, essentially. And he would set off and he would go and start raiding these Spanish settlements. He would go to Santiago, he would go to Santo Domingo, he would hit Cartagena. And by the time he's done doing this and he's sailing back, he's actually sailing back around the coast of Florida, which is, of course, the same route as the Spanish treasure fleet. And he literally stumbles upon something. As you can see from the map, the route of the Spanish treasure fleet. He is following it, and he has been to Cartagena, and he is coming around the Cape of Florida. In many cases, these settlements have, of course, been raided, plundered. He freed some slaves in one, he burned another. He is just causing havoc and chaos at any cost. Well, as they are sailing around the Cape of Florida, as the written account would specify, oh, yes, there is a written account by a man named Walter Biggs who was with Drake on this voyage. You can read it today. It's been reprinted several times throughout the years. It's called A Summary and True Discourse of Sir Francis Drake's West Indian Voyage. Anyway, I recommend short book, but in Old English, so some S's look like F's almost. Anyway, it says in there that they would spot this settlement by its wooden tower. Now, St. Augustine is not as profitable as these other settlements like Cartagena and Havana, and it is just not going to have the resources to be able to fend off an attack. It's strategic in that it is along the Spanish treasure fleet route, so if the treasure fleet ship needs to come in and dock and needs supplies, absolutely it's there to help. But it's really not well defended to take on Drake and his men as it is. So, as the account would state, Walter Biggs would state that they went in closer to see what place the enemy held there, for none amongst us had any knowledge thereof at all. Meaning they did not know this place. Would later go on to say that they had not known that this was the settlement of St. Augustine. And because they don't know what's going on, Drake decides to lead a scouting party all on his own. So he's going to get into a rowboat with 6 other men and 2 rowers. So this is 9 people in a little rowboat. They are rowing up the inlet towards the fort and are eventually spotted. So Drake and his men would return to the ships because he's not stupid. He's done this before. He was just trying to find out what he's in for, what he's up against. But he's going back to his ship and he's going to go from there. I'll figure out what to do, right? The Spanish are panicking. They are running away. They have fled out of the fort. They are running into the town. They've told the governor that, this is it. And the governor orders everybody to abandon the town, grab your kids, grab everything you can, and just run, seek shelter with the natives. Do not stay here. The funny part about this is that at the time they're running away, there's less than 10 people in a boat that they're running away from. And in the midst of all this chaos, one man is able to slip away unseen. And this would actually be a fifer who would get into a rowboat and get closer and closer to Drake's ships. And eventually the men on the ships are going, what's going on? Because they start hearing music. They can't figure this out. Well, eventually it's found that the music is the tune The Prince of Orange. And the fifer in the rowboat is essentially playing this to let him know that he's not Spanish. So when they finally get to talking. He says, "Oh yeah, this is the settlement of St. Augustine. They had 150 soldiers, but now they're all running away, and they're abandoning the town. There's only a handful of left, to even put up any kind of fight. There's not going to be any. Will you go get them now? Go do your thing, please, right? Because you're Sir Francis Drake. You're the one that the Spanish call the dragon, right?" And it was kind of, what? And why was this French fifer so eager to give all of this information? It's believed that this was the same fifer that Pedro Menendez stated in his letter to King Philip of Spain that he spared from the massacre of Ribault and his men 20 years before. And all you can start thinking is, this fifer must think that Drake is his savior at this point. This man has been held prisoner by Spanish Catholics for 20 years, and he is a French Protestant. You can only imagine what he had to endure. And now he's just like, go get them. Yeah, that's what they got. I can go with you, right? So eventually, everything is figured out. They know what's what, and now all there is to do is figure out, when are we going to attack? Well, just before daybreak on May 29th, 1586, Drake and his men would set out to raid and burn the town settlement of St. Augustine. They would start at the fort, and they decided to burn it. They actually said in the account that the ditches weren't dug yet, and the logs that made up the fort were actually just masts of pine, and really it hadn't been completed, so they didn't have any use for it. We'll just take care of that, and we'll go ahead and burn it. So they had to go back and get their ships to be able to attack in the town part itself. Now, the majority have already fled, and they've sought shelter with the native Timucuans. And Drake and his men wouldn't go any further inland than the settlement itself. So they did not have the encounter with the natives, which probably for them was a good thing. But Drake would lose one man throughout the whole ordeal. The few Spanish that did stay behind who tried to defend were unfortunately killed. But what is Drake actually getting out of this? Well, of course he's getting the satisfaction of being an English Protestant, just, causing trouble for a Spanish Catholic, King Philip of Spain. So, he's got that little bit going for him. But he would get a few supplies that he didn't have or actually had and just thought, I'm taking. And he would get what was believed to be the soldier's pay, which about 2,000 pounds sterling would be the amount in that time. But this would make the first outside threat to the settlement of St. Augustine. As I said before, they have their issues. They have issues with natives. They have issues with heat and illness and weather, but they've not had any kind of direct outside interference that would hurt their settlement. So now, if you are the governor, where does your mind go? Do you decide to fix things? Do you decide to rebuild? Do you decide to just check on your settlers and take them to your one other settlement that has lasted, not as long, but is still going, but the natives are not as friendly? So where do you go with this? And oh my gosh, how do I tell my king that his first permanent settlement along the Treasure Fleet route has just been sacked and burned by the dragon?